Welcome back to Munroe's Corner. We're back with another reaction. Today we're back with the intelligent brother Thomas Sowell. This is what they don't teach you about colonization. All right, let's jump into it, man. Road to 20K. We're getting there by the end of May because we turning up. We're growing a K a day, man. So thank y'all. Thank you in advance for liking and subscribing. And make sure you check because make sure if you subscribe, make sure you check because for some weird reason YouTube will unsubscribe you. So yeah, just do that check for your boy. All right, let's get into it.
Thomas Sowell is one of the greatest philosophers of our time, yet he isn't even mentioned among the 100 most influential African Americans in Ebony magazine. To help more people learn about him, please consider liking this video and subscribing. To get useful materials about Dr. Thomas Sowell, please visit the website. Thank you and let's begin.
That's crazy. That's crazy with, you know what I'm saying, with the amount of information he be giving out. People tend to shun people when they don't. People tend to shun people when they don't. When they go against the grain, when they don't bend the knee, or, you know, just agree. Like we got people that won't agree just because they don't agree 100% with you. That you're on the other side. You know what I'm saying? It could be a reason.
Well, you link wealth creation to the acquisition of skills and the employment of skills in a disciplined way, and also in a frugal way in terms of lifestyles. But others would attribute the generation of poverty, the obverse of wealth, to colonialism, imperialism, exploitation, economic exploitation. How do you handle those arguments?
Well, insofar as those arguments are meant seriously, you can simply look at evidence. Insofar as they're purely political arguments, they're saying what people want to hear. Obviously, there are people who would much rather hear that than to hear the other, because if you...
And just to point out what he said, they're saying what people want to hear. When you don't say what people want to hear, you get shunned. You know what I'm saying? Especially when you do it on a consistent basis. No matter how much no matter how much similar points you may have, but because you keep hitting them with stuff they don't want to hear, or you know, stuff that's lobbying against them, then, you know what I'm saying, you start getting a target on your back.
To hear. Obviously, there are people who would much rather hear that than to hear the other, because if you think that's the problem, then there's not only a quicker solution, but there's a more emotionally and morally satisfying solution. Namely, you fight against the exploiters and so on. If you look at the third world, for example, those parts of the third world where the imperialist powers have come in have typically been the more advanced parts of it. They've been the most prosperous ones. Even if they weren't prosperous before they got there, they became the more prosperous parts. Those parts of the third world that the imperialists have never touched are, almost without exception, the very poorest places on this earth.
So you don't find any any explanation for poverty and colonialism? The reverse, perhaps?
Oh, absolutely. That when the Romans, for example, invaded the British Isles, they conquered the southern part of Britain, but they never conquered Scotland. And for centuries thereafter, perhaps for 1,000 years thereafter, Scotland was far behind England in economic and cultural development, because England had the advantage of tying into the whole Roman civilization, and everything that it had created, to some extent, percolated down through the British. That doesn't mean the British were happy with the Romans being there. You know, 1,000 years later, Churchill could say, we owe London to Rome. But that's 1,000 years later, and Churchill didn't have to go through what those people went through. So I'm not saying this is good for the people who were there, but in the longer run, of course, England became what it was because the Romans came. And Scotland finally developed only after England conquered Scotland. And then the culture that developed in England then could spread into Scotland as well.
Well, does this suggest then...
That is a crazy way to look at it. But it makes sense. It's a messed up way to it's a jacked up way to progress. But what he's saying is that the parts of the country, like, hold on, let me go back to that first part.
Almost without exception, the powers have come in have typically been namely, you fight against the exploiters and so on. If you look at the third world, for example, those parts of the third world where the imperialist powers have come in have typically been the more advanced parts of it. They've been the most prosperous.
Yeah, so with the imperialist powers, the more progressive, the more dominant powers that came in and dominated the poor regions, the regions with who was behind in the culture. The more powerful, the more progressive parts that came in and dominated and conquered, you know what I'm saying, those regions, whatever, they became more progressive because they got dominated, and it's a takeover. So they dominated, and their culture became their culture. You see what I'm saying? Just like how the North dominated the South to free in the Civil War for slavery. South didn't want to give up slavery. They didn't want to progress. They didn't want to move on. The North has always been ahead of the South in transportation, manufacturing, plants like that. And so the South started taking on some of the North's culture, and we was able to progress more. You know what I'm saying? That's the logistics of. That's what I believe. I'm still down. Like, keep in mind, I'm learning. Y'all are watching me as I'm, digesting this. You know what I'm saying? So excuse me if my comprehension is off. But that's what I take of it. It's a jacked up way to progress. You know what I'm saying? Especially with, I mean, somebody coming through getting dominated. That means they. Them people, a lot of lives got killed and stuff like that. But what he's saying is, after they dominate, their culture became their culture because they had to. Because now that's where they are, and they're gonna learn. They have to learn their ways. They have to adapt to their ways. They're forced to adapt to their ways, and out of that force came progression.
Ones. Even if they weren't prosperous before they got there, they became the more prosperous parts. Those parts of the third world that the imperialists have never touched are, almost without exception, the very poorest places on this earth.
So you don't find any explanation for poverty and colonialism? The reverse, perhaps?
Oh, absolutely. That when the Romans, for example, invaded the British Isles, they conquered the southern part of Britain, but they never conquered Scotland. And for centuries thereafter, perhaps for 1,000 years thereafter, Scotland was far behind England in economic and cultural development, because England had the advantage of tying into the whole Roman civilization, and everything that it had created, to some extent, percolated down through the British. That doesn't mean the British were happy with the Romans being there. 1,000 years later, Churchill could say, we owe London to Rome. But that's 1,000 years later, and Churchill didn't have to go through what those people went through. So I'm not saying this is good for the people who were there, but in the longer run, of course, England became what it was because the Romans came. And Scotland finally developed only after England conquered Scotland. And then the culture that developed in England then could spread into Scotland as well.
Well, does this suggest then that in addressing poverty in today's world, there ought to be a latter-day reincarnation of imperialism or colonialism in some form?
No, because I think politically it's impossible. I hear from various parts of some
can't say that.
They say that they were better off under colonialism and so on. That isn't in the cards. The people who are in the imperialist nations don't want to take on that.
But some would say that there is the functional equivalent of that in the operation of the multinational corporation today. Do you see that, the operation of the multinational corporation, as help or hindrance to the generation of wealth in developing countries?
Well, in those countries, the multinational corporations very often not only pay more money than the local industry pays, but it brings in skills that don't exist and creates industries that never were there before. To that extent, I think they are a source of the transmission of international human capital. To that extent, yes.
Now, this excerpt is taken from the book, Intellectuals and Race, by Dr. Thomas Sowell. In addition to the inherent geographic advantages that Western Europe has had over Eastern Europe, for example, more navigable waterways leading to the open seas, with Western European rivers and harbors not being frozen over, as often or as long in winter as rivers and harbors in Eastern Europe, due to the warming effect of the Gulf Stream on Western Europe. Another major historic advantage growing out of geography is that Western Europe was more readily accessible to invasion by Roman conquerors. Despite the ruthless slaughters in those conquests and the subsequent brutal oppressions by the Roman overlords, among the lasting advantages which the Roman conquests brought to Western Europe were Roman letters, so that Western European languages had written versions centuries before the languages of Eastern Europe did. To the enormous advantages of literacy, as such, Western Europeans had the further advantage of a far greater accumulation of written knowledge in their languages, even after the languages of Eastern Europe began to develop written versions, but still had not yet caught up with the centuries-long accumulations of knowledge written in Western European languages. Literacy was not the only thing that moved from west to east in Europe. So did coins, printing presses, castles, crossbows, paved streets, and vaccinations, among other economic and social advances. But all of this took time, sometimes centuries. Moreover, people from Western Europe, Germans, Jews and others, were often a majority of the population in Eastern European cities in earlier centuries, while Slavs remained a huge majority in the surrounding countrysides. For example, before 1312 the official records of the city of Krakow were kept in German, and the
He said Slavs. Is that slaves? Is that slaves? He's referring to? Was that the origins?
Example, before 1312 the official record in Eastern European cities in earlier centuries, while Slavs remained a huge majority in the surrounding countrysides. For example, before 1312 the official records of the city of Krakow were kept in German, and the transition, at that point, was to Latin. Only decades later did Poles become a majority of the population in Krakow. The towns of medieval East Central Europe were often cultural enclaves of foreigners, again, mostly Germans, but with many Jews as well and, in the Balkans, Greeks and Armenians, joined in later centuries by Turks. In short, there has been for centuries, not only a disparity between the opportunities and advances in the two halves of Europe, but great disparities within Eastern Europe itself, between the indigenous peoples of the region, and the transplanted Western Europeans living in Eastern Europe, the Baltic and the Balkans. Neither genes nor discrimination are necessary to explain this situation, though some intellectuals and politicians have chosen to claim that the differences have been due to race and others have chosen to blame social injustices. Many other racial and other groups in many other parts of the world have likewise ended up with large disparities in opportunities and achievements, for reasons that range across a wide spectrum and cannot be reduced to genes or injustices. Thank you for watching this presentation to the end. Please don't forget to like, share, and subscribe.
Wow. I learn something new every time. That was wild. Wow, so yeah, I believe what I said earlier pretty much summed up everything. Like, you progress, the progression came from the Imperials. The more the progression of the society came from the more dominant figures that was more progressive in education and just manufacturing, just everything, you know what I'm saying, and adapt, and people being forced to adapt to their ways after being conquered. It's a real jacked up way to progress. But it looks like that's what happened. That's wild. That is wild. Yeah, I'm definitely about to do some research after this video about this. Yeah, this is very interesting. Yeah. I'm like I said, we going down the Thomas Sowell rabbit hole, you know what I mean? So, Thing about me, I'm just open. You know what I'm saying? I'm open to receive, to learn, not shutting anybody's opinions down, or, you know what I'm saying, facts or whatever. I do my fact checking after I do these videos as well. You know what I'm saying? But yeah, man, I'm just willing to learn more and stuff, man. And yeah, let's if you enjoyed this reaction, let me give me a like for the algorithm and subscribe for the channel growth. We're on the road to 20K. And we're gonna get there by the end of May. You know what I'm saying? We're gonna get there by the end of May. We at 16. We at 16 at the day. So let's do it, man. All right. Peace out, man. One love.